Sometimes you hear people say, well, it's just kids. They don't know any better. I think you can overstate that. But you can also overstate how ideologically committed folks are to this sort of thing.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer of The Bulletin. This week, we've got a special treat for you. We're recording live from CT's quarterly meeting, where our staff gathers from around the globe to celebrate our successes, plot out new endeavors, and hone our skills as communicators and gospel bearers. Joining Mike Cosper and me today are CT's president and CEO, Tim Dalrymple, and CT's news editor, Daniel Silliman. Today, we're talking about the protests on college campuses. Who's camping on the quad and why? We visited Columbia University and we're sharing what we learned on the ground. Then, the United Methodist Church meets this week to remove LGBTQ language from its books. While many conservative churches have left the denomination, others have committed to stay. What can we learn from both? We've got a great show today. Let's dive right in. Mike, so last week you and I met in New York City for lunch, but before we met up, I was walking around the city with my son, and we happened to be walking behind a group of college girls who were talking about a bomb threat on campus and whether or not protesters had been behind it. I was sort of shocked by their nonchalance as they walk the city streets using words like bomb threats and encampments and protests as though this was a normal part of university life these days. Unfortunately, for almost 50 college campuses across the U.S., this has become increasingly present and disruptive over the last couple of weeks as protests have sprung up in response to the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. And you were on that trip to New York to visit Columbia University, and I'm wondering, what did it look like on the ground?
So these protests began on April 17th. This was the day before President Shafiq, the president of Columbia University, was before Congress. The day after she sent in the NYPD, they broke up the encampment. And it was kind of seen briefly as this moment of the adults are in the room, they're restoring order, their concern for Jewish students that was being expressed was being taken seriously. But then within 24 hours of that, the encampment was rebuilt. They were back up. So I was on campus on April the 25th, and I spoke with a Columbia student as well who was a Christian student. His name's Rory Wilson. And you know what he said was the campus is split. The students are split. And so as a result, most of the campus ministries were pretty divided over the issue as well. And they were caring for the souls of the kids, but they're not necessarily invested in one side or the other of the debate around all of this. Obviously, it's been a pretty eventful week with these protests. They've escalated in various ways. The weekend before I came had been a much more aggressive and a much more violent set of protests. The kinds of confrontations that were happening between protesters and counter-protesters, the language of the protests, a lot of the chants were literally Islamist chants. One of them being, we're familiar with from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free chant. They were chanting in Arabic, which is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab, which is literally an ethnic cleansing chant. They were chanting glory to the martyrs. And so as a result of some of that violence and that kind of thing, the campus was shut down. And again, this is the weekend before I came. The campus was shut down to anybody who was not a student. Once they closed it down to where it was students only, things were very calm, and they remained mostly calm for the next week. And then just a couple of nights ago, Hamilton Hall at Columbia was taken over by the protesters as well. It was occupied by these protesters. And then this student that I spoke with when I was up there, Rory Wilson, he was one of a handful of students that tried to sort of intervene as this hall was being taken over. And this went viral online. He and his friend of his blocking this off. So we spoke with him as well.
Can we back up here a little bit? Because I was reading last night that there are students who are even observing Shabbat in the encampments. So who's showing up to these protests? We've heard conversation about this being rabid anti-Semitism, naive Islamism on campus. Some folks are saying, hey, the bad guys are just the people who are off campus. Students are being very peaceful as they protest here. Do students actually know what they're protesting about? And who is showing up to these events?
Yeah. even in talking with him, it was hard for him to say. He said, there's definitely familiar faces in there, people I know from class, and they're participating kind of at all levels of this. But there's definitely a sense that outside interests are involved in these protests. There's been some interesting questions raised as well about how are these being organized? How are they being funded? Because it was kind of like Columbia happened and then suddenly they popped up everywhere else. This isn't a cheap thing to do. They're bringing in outside speakers. These campus organizations are funding some of that. A tent isn't cheap these days. They had nice tents. They all matched. Clearly there's some money being spent. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what's going on with the kids, I think that's one of those things that's difficult. On the one hand, these are over 18 kids. So kids can be misleading. And sometimes you hear people say, well, it's just kids. They don't know any better. I think you can overstate that. But you can also overstate how ideologically committed folks are to this sort of thing. I talked to a friend of mine who's a professor at another sort of elite university in the Northeast. And his comment on this is, yeah, people are really bought in on a lot of this stuff, but also college students are really bought in on camping and doing drum circles and doing TikTok dances. And so there's something appealing about this that is not necessarily even about the cause, except that you've attached this sense of moral righteousness, like being on the right side of history in this.
Well, so that begs the question then, has the university's administration response been appropriate? Because it was really controversial when the NYPD came onto Columbia's campus. The LAPD has been called to UCLA. State and local police had to respond to Tulane. Is police response appropriate? Will Creeley mentioned in The Atlantic this week, he said the answer is to ignore it, mock it, debate it, even counter-protest it, but don't call in the SWAT team.
So part of my feeling on the issue is that it's hard to judge this conversation apart from the broader context of campus life these days and campus discourse these days. For the vast majority of Jews on campus, and for the vast majority of the Jews in the U.S., they see a glaring double standard in what's taking place at these protests and what's taking place around other political hot-button issues. So if you back up to the summer of 2020 to Black Lives Matter protests, that sort of thing, if you can imagine counter-protesters on a college campus showing up at a Black Lives Matter rally and saying things that could be deemed, even borderline deemed, racist in some form or another, how would the college have responded to those students? It would have looked very, very different. If you had a group of students chanting the white supremacist equivalent of glory to the martyrs or holding up signs, there was a Columbia student that was photographed holding a sign that said, Al-Qassam Brigades, here's your next target. And they were pointing at a group of students waving Israeli flags some of them were wearing kippahs and sort of obviously Jewish. Again, the double standard being, do that with anybody but Jews, and there would be a different kind of response from the administration. That's where you see particularly a lot of Jewish voices saying, look, you either have a free speech standard on campus or you don't. These are Ivy League schools primarily where, at least certainly the Ivy League schools are the ones that we're hearing the most about. And if you go look at the record, there's an organization called FIRE that kind of tracks free speech on campus. If you look at the record for who has the most draconian rules limiting free speech on campus, it's these Ivy League schools. But so long as you're calling for the genocide of the Jews, it's totally free speech. I think the double standard is so obvious, so I don't think it can last. But in terms of the damages, like literally the damages from civil rights damage to buildings and damages from civil rights lawsuits that are going to be happening at a lot of these schools around the country, damage is done.
I'm a mom who's got kids headed to college. I think about the damage to college students. Did Rory mention what his Jewish friends are experiencing as they're trying to navigate campus in the midst of all this?
Yeah, what in particular he was seeing was, again, mostly angst about the double standard, right? Mm-hmm. He wasn't terribly concerned about his physical safety or anything like that. Now, we spoke yesterday, around the time that he and I spoke, his name and face made it online.
That may change.
Yeah. And, listeners may have noticed this if you're on Twitter. So Rory Wilson's father is Christian author N.D. Wilson. His grandfather is Douglas Wilson. They were both posting about this. So, it's very much out there that he was attached to this story. And I asked him, I said, do you feel safe walking around campus? Are you concerned about any of this? And he was like, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it yet, So,
typical college student.
Yeah. So we'll see. But I think what he was seeing and hearing from Jewish students in particular was just a sense of abandonment by the administration. Not so much, man, our physical safety is really threatened, because there's something almost comical about the nature of the student protests themselves. Now, the weekend protests that were full of outsiders, that were much more militant, that were much more aggressive, that was a different thing. Everybody on the campus were kind of overwhelmed by that. But among the students themselves, it was more about, look, why are we tolerating this when any other sort of bias like this wouldn't be permitted, wouldn't be tolerated? An encampment like this wouldn't be tolerated for almost anything.
Yeah.
And like I said, some of that probably has to do with who Columbia is ideologically as well. Well,
the calendar turns this week to May. Graduation's coming soon. What happens now? I know that Columbia has shifted to hybrid classes. Are commencements going to happen across the country in these schools, or they're making other plans?
So the chairs are on the lawn.
Okay.
So they're moving towards it. What Columbia does is all underclassmen get sent home. So technically only graduating students are supposed to be there. But, we've seen a lot of schools around the country cancel commencement ceremonies of various types. USC canceled theirs. The way USC does theirs is that you graduate with the school that you graduated from, and then there's a big ceremony for everybody. The schools are doing theirs. The big ceremony has been canceled. But I think we're going to see a lot of protests at these events when they try to do them. But I think you're going to only see it at the places that tolerated it. Because the contrast to this is Duke University, when these protests have broken out, the moment they've gotten out of hand at Duke, they've shut them down. They've called in security. They've called in the police. The University of Florida, an encampment was set up. Campus officials went around and they handed out a letter. And the letter basically said, you have the right to free speech. You have the right to say and think and do whatever you want to do. But here are the rules. And if you break these rules, you will be escorted off of the campus and you'll be banned from the campus for 3 years. One of the rules being you can't put tents in the lawn, And so there have been a number of schools that have kind of responded like that. And remarkably, when you enforce the rules quickly, the encampments seem to kind of go away. So I think the campuses that have had a problem with it will continue to have a problem with it unless the tolerance policies change.
Yeah. Well, pomp and circumstance is certainly going to sound different this year for many students. So thanks for the update, Mike. We will be right back. And we're back. Since we're recording live this week from CT's quarterly meetings, we've got the great privilege of continuing this conversation with our president and CEO, Tim Dalrymple, and our news editor, Daniel Silliman. Tim, Daniel, thanks for joining us on the Bulletin.
It's good to be here.
We wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this topic today because we know that Christians have a lot of questions about the Israel-Hamas war, not just in terms of foreign policy and actions overseas, but how those larger decisions are influencing the everyday conversations and relationships here at home. In many ways, we are a country of protesters. My dear ancestors, those feisty Bostonians, threw their tea into the harbor in 1773, and protests have been with us ever since. They brought us women's suffrage and expanded civil rights. And in fact, when Columbia students took over Hamilton Hall this week, it might be well seen as a historic gesture. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Daniel, how these protests are similar or different from other eras?
The modern movement starts in 1964, the University of California, Berkeley, and it's known today as the free speech movement. It really was around Berkeley's rules about who could have an information booth. So there was a civil rights group, Congress on Racial Equality, that tried to have a booth passing out information about the freedom rides. And the school said, that's all very nice, but we have rules around these things, and our rules say the only political speech that's allowed on campus has to be either associated with the Democrats or the Republicans. All other political speech is not allowed. You're not a Democratic Party organization, so off with you. They also basically hadn't enforced this for years and decided to suddenly strictly enforce it in this case in particular. and arrested a student for passing out information. And in response to that, something like 3,000 students swarmed the arrest, surrounded the police car, and stopped the arrest from happening. And people started giving speeches about free speech from the hood and roof of the police car in Berkeley in 1964. One of the really famous ones was from a guy named Mario Savio, who talked about there are times when the system becomes so odious that you have to throw your bodies upon the gears. And that really became the model for the idea of student protests. They took over an administration building shortly thereafter, Sproul Hall, and kind of forced the university to change its policies around who was allowed to speak, who was allowed to pass out information on the campus. The other sort of interesting historical thing that happened in that moment in particular is it's often seen as directly connected to Ronald Reagan's election as governor of California 2 years later, that the protest might have been seen as sort of a local issue, but a conservative politician was able to use it to characterize his opponents as all sort of petulant upper-class college students who, are not appreciative of the privilege that society has given them, and they're sort of just rich brats, basically. And he sort of promised to be stricter and to bring order to the chaos of society. So the modern conservative movement is also, at least to the extent that it's connected to Ronald Reagan, is also directly connected to this kind of history.
And Nixon kind of follows that model in 68.
Yeah,
Nixon's
victory in 68, though Nixon ends up provoking more protests than he puts down. There were 30 colleges that were burned down or bombed in the anti-Vietnam War protests. There were something like 800 protests just that year when Nixon expanded the war in Vietnam.
I think of the Kent State
Absolutely.
Shootings, for instance. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the history of how administrations have responded and some of the complexities that some administrations may be sorting through today.
I think it's really complicated. We as a society have some conflicting views of what students are. Sometimes we see them as like young political actors, the vanguard, the shock troops of whatever the most important issue. They're the easiest people to mobilize for your political issue. But then we also see them as like, they're just students. They should be learning. They shouldn't be disrupting this space. We also have a really conflicted idea of what colleges are. Are colleges public space for debate? Are they private property that should be controlled by the administration? Do they belong to the students? What part of what's going on at college should be education and what part of it should be research and development? A lot of these protests were around students believing that colleges should be for educating them and then learning that they're also like a key part of the war effort in Vietnam. So in Columbia in 1968, the college was doing classified research for the military. So what is Columbia? Is it for training students, or is it for working with the government and doing the latest research, which happens to be military research in this case? But yeah, the history of colleges, calling police, calling the National Guard, the risks of that are sometimes dead students. As we saw in Kent State, 4 people were shot May of 1970. It's still a little confusing what exactly led to that shooting. But if you as the administration are more gentle, you often get pounded by donors, by politicians. Like the cost of doing nothing are pretty high. The cost of overreacting are pretty high. It's not clear to me, at least, that there's a sort of consistently decent and effective way to respond to student protest, especially when they are doing this tactic, which we saw in 64, and we're seeing again at Columbia right now, of actually occupying an administration building. It's not just sort of camping out on a quad or marching around in a circle. It's actually taking over.
In which case, accommodating one set of students may be inconveniencing, to put it mildly, an entirely different set of students who are there to do their work.
And just accommodating other people as well. In Columbia in 68, they actually took a dean and kept him, I would say hostage, but they didn't use that term at the time. But they not only took the dean's office, they took the dean.
And it was out of those protests the Weatherman Organization forms, which was essentially a terror organization. I read one stat that you could attribute 1,200 terror attacks in the following years, mail bombs and different things that kind of came out of that counter war.
So a lot of these protests were led by the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and the Weathermen were a faction who thought that protesting was not enough.
Right.
If we're going to throw our bodies on the gears, let's use explosives. So
right.
I've got a question here because there's another side of the coin here. At least it's been argued by Sergei Shmemin in the New York Times this week. He said that student protest is an essential part of education. And he actually harkens back to 1968, saying if we look at what happened after the Columbia protests in 68, many of these folks went on to careers in social service. They were ignited by the idealism of their youth to do really good things in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Is there an argument that could be made that this is an appropriate sort of rite of passage for students?
I would say that universities are right to preserve a space, and they're required by the Supreme Court to value neutral spaces for people to demonstrate and to protest. And if you think about that time in your life, right, it's a time when you're becoming cognizant that the world is a big, sometimes beautiful, but always a very complicated place. And you're beginning to take some responsibility for your role within that world, right? So I think there are a variety of ways of standing up for the things that you believe in. And I don't hear anybody really saying there should be no space for demonstration, there should be no space for protest. I think so much of the concern right now is the extremes to which it's going. There is a way to be pro-Palestinian and against Hamas, and there's a way to be pro-Palestinian and not anti-Semitic. Part of what is so difficult about the present situation is that there is actually so much anti-Semitism that's emerging within these contexts. And it's kind of been a drawing back of the veil, and that I think is showing some pretty unhealthy elements that have been cultivated within not only elite academia. It's really, we talk about the Columbias and the Harvards and Stanfords, and there are protests there in those places. But you're also talking about Sacramento State and Cal Poly Humboldt. And so it's really across the entirety of academia right now.
Yeah.
I'm always a little concerned about, on the left, there's a lot of mythologizing of the student protest. It's not always clear to me. They might be useful and important for the people involved, but it's not always clear to me that they have had the impact that people who are currently in their 60s or 70s want to remember them as having. And on the other hand, I see that on the right as well, there's a lot of nut picking, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of finding one crazy student and running a whole campaign on that. I find it very hard to tell when you look at one protest, what is the political reasonableness of these people. There's someone chanting in a Vietnam War protest for the victory of the communists in North Vietnam. Is that an extremist who happened to show up? Is that someone who got out of hand? Is that the true feelings of these protesters? I think it's actually really hard to kind of sort through these things. And I at least want to be cautious about both of these tendencies, both of the seeing the student protest as symptomatic of some deep sickness with the young people these days, or as sort of heroizing them of what great the next generation is going to save us and look at all this great stuff that they've always done.
A friend of mine I mentioned earlier who's a professor at one of these universities was saying there is a sense in which there's something about these public expressions that are maybe not so much a part of this is what it means to be a student. It is part of learning in terms of this is what it means to be a university and have an open forum for these ideas. What I think keeps coming up in this conversation is the sense of double standard, that there's a license to take speech to places in these protests and in these conversations to a level of extremism and radicalism that would not be tolerated if you were talking about a different ethnic group, different religious group, however you kind of want to frame the conversation.
Well, so let's talk about that then. If a university is supposed to be a culture of genuine inquiry, how do universities do this? Well, what kind of boundaries need to exist in these kind of forums? And then I guess I would also ask, why aren't Christian college students protesting right now? Is there something fundamentally different about the environment in a Christian college that doesn't sort of cause these things to foment?
I don't know that they aren't. Do Christian campuses have an environment where this sort of thing is fostered and tolerated and kind of part of the culture? I think that's probably the gap. But I think if you look at what's going on even inside campus ministries in places like Columbia, the students are on both sides of these issues. And so I think if you walked through the encampment and interviewed people, you'd find a lot of Christians in the encampment who are sort of deeply committed to Palestinian liberation theology. I mean, there's an appetite for that. And if you look at the Palestine liberation movement, the Palestinian Christian movement, they've had a presence in some of these campus ministries as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that Christians aren't there. It's they're not there wearing their WWJD bracelet as the first indicator of what part they are on either side of this argument.
I think part of the problem is what Mike referenced earlier, the double standard, that we can't have conservatives come and speak on campuses on certain topics, but we can have groups of people who are chanting wildly anti-Semitic slogans, right? And so I think alumni are looking at that and wrestling with what has become of these universities and what is really their vision for the reason that they exist. Is it about the pursuit of truth, and is it about engaging charitably and thoughtfully with diversity of viewpoints, or is it about kind of this is a training ground for political activism? And the truth is it's a variegated picture. At a lot of these schools, there are pockets where it is still very much about the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. And then there are pockets where it's, the language of truth itself is suspect, right? That has been a part of the narrative that has been used to oppress people groups and empower other groups. And so if you've kind of given up on the concept of truth and given up on a certain vision of the university, then why not? Why not turn it into something that advances the power of your favorite groups and takes power away from the groups that you think are wrong? And so I think a lot of administrations find themselves, to the point that you made, Daniel, some of these university administrations are led by people either who participated in demonstrations in the 60s and 70s or grew up with kind of a lionized view of that. And now they find themselves, oh my gosh, I don't want to be the people who are calling in the cops.
Right.
I was supposed to be on the other side of things, right? And with this heroic, romanticized vision, it just puts them, now I'm in the position of the oppressor if I send in the National Guard. And yet, on the other hand, I have all of these other students that I need to take care of who feel endangered and feel like they're not able to get what they came to the university for. And I have a lot of alumni and faculty on both sides of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, I think the conditions of the protest are interesting. It is often a quandary because of these questions around free speech and these questions around who's allowed to say what and what does it look like to seek truth together and what are the boundaries on that. But it's also the case that most of these protests, both now and historically, start because the university has some other relationship to the issue at hand. Right. So Columbia has certain investments, not absurd, not very out of the norm, but it wasn't just people saying, I feel a certain way about the Israel-Hamas war. It was saying, I feel a certain way about the Israel-Hamas war, and I feel complicit because I'm a part of this university. I'm contributing financially to this university.
Columbia also is the academic home of Edward Said and Rashid Khalidi. Khalidi was the PLO spokesperson throughout the 1970s and, the author of a best-selling book called The 100-Year War on Palestine.
There's more than one way to be complicit, for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it's the academic hub of a particularly militant anti-Israel ideology.
And then the protests tend to spread to other universities in response to the crackdown. So it's students looking at other students being arrested that sort of spurs that on. I also think it's always really interesting that the kinds of issues that become the source of these kind of protests are the kinds of issues where it doesn't feel like there's easy political solutions or it doesn't feel like there's a political representative of your position. Protest always seems to me historically to be something like politics when the normal roots of politics don't seem effective. I mean, we definitely see that in the civil rights movement, right? Like if people could have just voted for the candidate who was going to push through a civil rights bill, then they wouldn't have taken over private restaurants and stopped them from doing business. But that path was closed to them. Therefore, protesting and sort of social disruption and direct action of various times made sense.
I don't know. I definitely think there's a lot of that. But I also, when you see people who are interviewed at protests who sometimes seem like they have very little idea why they're even there, right? It's just, this looked exciting to be a part of. And so I came over from the campus across town to be a part of this. And so I suspect there's a little bit of both.
Certainly, those years, 18 to 22, are a big time of change for students. Their brains aren't even fully formed at that point, right? You don't have a fully formed brain until age 25.
I'm still waiting for mine to be fully formed, if I'm honest.
Well, I looked back at some research from Lifeway, and they said in 2017 that 70% of college students had acknowledged that they had stopped attending church regularly for at least a year during that span of time between ages 18 and 22. We also know from Lifeway that they've reported that this generation has less interest in Israel than generations before. So are these things related? Do we see a lack of discipleship that has birthed these kinds of responses from students?
The way I think about this, I don't know if it's a lack of discipleship so much as it's reflective of a shift of the national conversation. I grew up in very mainstream evangelical churches. Israel was a big part of the conversation. The end times were a big part of the conversation.
Left Behind.
The Cold War, all that stuff was all part of it. And so you sort of took for granted, like, well, of course we're pro-Israel because we need Israel because it sets the table for the return of Jesus and all of this. And part of the way I think Left Behind changed the church's conversation around Israel is Left Behind became kind of a punchline, and my generation stopped talking about eschatology. And many in my generation went from reading Left Behind to reading N.T. Wright and going, oh yeah, I don't believe any of that stuff about national Israel anyway. And so there's been a bit of a vacuum around, well, what do we make of this historical phenomenon post-1948? And, other things I think fill the vacuum. And so I don't know if discipleship is quite the right word, but I do think that there's certainly a shift of tone or a shift of perspective that shapes some of that.
I think there's probably a really complicated answer to the causal relationship between church attendance and protests, which I think would ultimately get down to something like both are expressions of a feeling that the system doesn't work or that there's something deeply broken in society, right? People leave church historically as a kind of it's just not doing it for me. It just doesn't seem important to life, or I don't want the things out of life that they're actually offering me.
And yet there's this longing for community.
There is a longing for community, which they aren't finding it at church. It's not like they went to church and there was a great community and they have a longing for community in somewhere else, right? There's a very clear, yes, I longed for these things. I longed for social change. I longed for meaning. I longed for someone to have a strong moral voice. And people said they didn't find that at church. We might disagree with them about whether they found it or why they didn't find it. But I think there's a deep commonality between that kind of politics of protest and the rejection of church life. But it's not like the one caused the other, I don't think. But as the historian, I will point out the last big surge of church attendance in the United States came immediately after the protest of the 1960s and 70s, and it was many of the same people. The Jesus People movement brought a lot of Christians into evangelicalism by specifically reaching out to people who were protesting and speaking to people who were protesting. So, there was one response of the church at the time to just sort of bemoan the country going to hell in the handbasket. And there was another response to let's tell these people about Jesus. Let's take their concerns seriously. Let's suggest that some of the ways that culture and politics and Christianity have been wedded, that they're actually right to critique. I mean, I think a big part of Francis Schaeffer's early success was saying, you're not wrong. Your parents are hypocrites. The church has failed. Let's talk about how it could do better. And the sort of true message of Jesus is not wear a suit and get a job. It's something actually more radical, and you're right about the radicalism and the need for that kind of radicalism.
Yeah, I think to your question, Clarissa, we are created to give ourselves to something so much bigger than ourselves, right? And if we have that deep yearning to be a part of a bigger story and a bigger community, and we don't find that within the church, I think we are going to find it somewhere else. And, these protest movements can give people a really animating vision for their life, right? That you were a part of an incredibly important historic cause. And that helps you find meaning and purpose in your life. And there's a book that I've been thinking about a lot since these protests broke out. And I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's called Babel by R.F. Kuang, Kuang. The subtitle, it's Babel or the Necessity of Violence. And I won't go through the whole story, but it has to do with someone from Guangdong, from Canton, China, who ends up at Oxford and falls in love with the mythology of the university and the beauty of academic life. And you can really feel that the author of this book, she spent some time at Oxford. You can feel the love for the university. But the main character over time comes to the view that Oxford has also been part of the engine of British imperialism, right? And this kind of colonial and imperial machine that has dominated so many people groups around the world, including in his own China. So he comes to see that complicity and revolts and comes to the conclusion that violence really is necessary in that revolt against this corrupt machine and institution. And it's written by a brilliant writer. I enjoyed the first half. The second half was so preachy, and I so disagreed with where it landed that I couldn't enjoy it quite as much. But it's definitely sort of an insight, I think, into the journey and the perspective that I see reflected right now in a lot of students who are openly saying, yes, violence is justified for us who are protesting these things.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned Kent State earlier, and when we're thinking about where do things go from here, where are these students going to go, what does it mean for faith? One person who converted to Christianity shortly after the violence at Kent State was Tim Keller through campus ministry there, and obviously had a pretty profound influence on our organization and the church in the years after that.
Yeah.
You know, I was raised in a California church, and a set of California churches really that were shaped by the Jesus People movement. And it was this kind of breezy, convivial, sunlit T-shirt and sandals version of American evangelicalism that I think was a huge blessing in my life. And so we can pray for things like that. And we can also, to your point, Mike, pray for campus ministries. So as I see these, I think it's easy to kind of take out our frustrations with elite institutions or elite academia. But we should be praying for the students in the camps. We should be praying for the students who are not in the camps. We should be praying for the administration. They're in very difficult positions. And definitely I would be praying for the campus ministries in those places. It's a moment that's ripe with spiritual opportunity. Maybe a new Jesus People movement could grow out of this, or whatever the equivalent may be, but also with real spiritual peril.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. We'll be right back. And we're back. This week, the United Methodist Church gathered for its quadrennial General Conference, the first since it saw a mass exodus of almost 7,600 congregations who disagreed with the denomination's movement toward LGBTQ inclusion. Daniel, you've followed this story for a long time now. So speaking of protest, could you give us a little backstory? What has brought us to this historic moment for the UMC?
Yeah, long sort of historical tensions within the United Methodist Church, the denomination. They've kind of always had tensions. The United has always been a little more aspirational than real, I think, going back to 68 when they were founded. But yeah, in the last few years, there's been this conflict specifically over sort of policies around sexuality and how to treat LGBTQ Christians, whether pastors could perform marriages, whether the official term is self-avowed practicing homosexuals in the Book of Discipline, whether those people could be ordained. This came to a head a few years ago when the UMC created a new policy that allowed congregations to leave. So they essentially created an exit path after several other plans failed. And a little more than 7,600 congregations left, which is about 25% of all congregations. Many of those are now kind of non-denominational Wesleyan churches that have not joined something else. And a bunch of them, maybe a little more than half, have formed a new denomination called the Global Methodist Church.
Yeah. Now, 24% of the UMC congregations who have decided to stay consider themselves conservative.
Well, that was in one state in particular, that study. So yeah, it's not that all of the traditionalists are
leaving.
Gone.
Yeah.
The UMC as a denomination is still a lot of different types of churches and a lot of different sort of varieties of Wesleyan theology. But there was a study of churches in North Carolina in particular, which has a lot of Methodists and Methodist schools, and they found that almost a quarter of pastors still consider themselves, or congregations still consider themselves conservative in the UMC. It's also a global organization, so there's also many African churches that are still a part of the UMC that are very traditional on questions of sexuality, which are creating ongoing tensions. So in the meeting that they're having this week, the church is making changes. So far, they've dropped a ban on nominating LGBTQ candidates for ordination. They've dropped the penalties for officiating a same-sex marriage, and they've dropped a ban on funding for LGBTQ affinity groups. Interestingly, all of those happened without any debate. The vote just sort of sailed through. At the time of our recording, they're still looking at probably the most significant changes, which would be dropping the ban altogether on ordaining LGBTQ people and dropping a statement in the Book of Discipline that says that homosexuality is incompatible with the teachings of Christianity. We expect the denomination to drop those, but, something could happen. We'll see.
So I thought that United Methodist Church had a really interesting way of trying to navigate this. We've watched this happen with the Mennonite Church, with PCUSA. Various denominations are wrestling with how to manage these issues. But the General Conference determined that they would split up the global denomination into these 4 equal regions. So you've got the Africa, you've got Europe, the Philippines, and then the United States, giving each of these jurisdiction over developing their own book of discipline. Is this how you save a denomination that's splitting? Do we just say we're going to all go our separate ways and somehow live under this big tent together?
It seems unlikely to work. I think having 4 distinct books of discipline, I think that just feels odd to everyone. It also feels like insulating the American church from the sort of moral concerns and religious concerns of the African church, which is actually a majority in the UMC, sort of not letting them have a say. But it is a larger question that gets a lot into sort of polity debates and government debates. The people that I've talked to are sort of, whatever their position on the topic of debate, they've been deeply demoralized by their ability to reason together, their ability to disagree in kindness, their ability to feel like there's some progress being made. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the people who left said, we just kind of don't trust that this can work, regardless of what the General Conference decides this year or next year or whatever.
Yeah.
Something we would talk about a lot in church planting way back is like, how do you think about partnering with other churches in your city or other networks? And there's kind of 2 philosophies you can take. One is this idea of a centered set of values, like we all share this common core and we're going to differ on all kinds of stuff that's not on, whatever your core statement of faith is. But we're not worried about that. We're focused on the center. Christ is at the center. And so long as we can share that, we can partner on all kinds of stuff. And then the other way people think about it is they call it the bound set. And I always thought the language of like border policing is helpful with this, where you say, not only are we going to have a core, but we're also going to have a set of boundaries. And we're going to say, this is as far as you can go, right? And obviously more sort of fundamentalist minded or more like a lot of SBC churches are very concerned about what those boundaries are. We say male only leadership in the church. How far does that mean? Does that mean that can a woman preach? Can a woman pray from the stage? Can a woman lead worship? Can a woman lead a Bible study for only women? Some people would say no. And so that border policing can get really draconian really quickly. And so I think when I look at what the UMC is doing, it seems like they're saying, okay, we're going all in on centered set values, and we're going to create a lot of ambiguity around all kinds of other stuff. If I'm a member of a UMC church who has a high propensity for moving on a regular basis, my job's going to make me move around every 2 or 3 years, it creates a kind of interesting dilemma because I might move from Louisville, Kentucky to Raleigh-Durham, and I can't just go, well, where are the UMC churches in town? It creates that next layer of going, what brand of UMC am I dealing with now, and what are those values? I think the other questions that it raises are what does matter, right? To define who we are as a community. I think it's fascinating when I hear stories of pastors and even churches inside denominations that are split over these issues. For instance, I have a good friend who was a pastor in the Episcopal Church for many, many years and was probably more theologically conservative than I am. And, when I said, how are you sticking around this community? He's like, well, it's a mission field. He's like, these people don't believe in the bodily resurrection, and I want to convince them that it's true. So I think there are layers of challenges for this that are really going to be defining for the UMC, and I think it exposes the limits of that centered set philosophy.
Yeah, I resonate, and I want to respect different callings. So at Christianity Today, we hold to a traditional Christian sexual ethic. And so we have a lot of sympathy for those who feel that they need to be a part of a communion of believers that shares their views on that matter. This has been a tension throughout the course of church history, as Daniel knows full well. The question of what are the essentials, what are the non-essentials? There's the famous saying, right? In essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity, which is wrongly attributed to Augustine. It doesn't really go back that far, but it does elucidate the tension that I think we've always had to navigate. We're always going to have things that we disagree with, even in the local church body, right? And how do we unite around Christ? And how do we respect the fact that some people are called to be in a community that aligns with their beliefs as thoroughly as possible? Some are called to be in communities where they are going to have more of a missionary disposition. And so I can respect churches that decide, we need to depart the UMC and to be a part of this new global Methodist Church. And I can respect those who decide that I really want to stay because I have built relationships here. I think there's a lot of beautiful things that God is doing, and I want to continue to be a part of advocating for what I perceive to be the right interpretation of Scripture here.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I know inside the PCUSA, one of the things that emerged and one of the reasons a lot of conservative churches stayed was because of denominational ownership of property. Is that a factor in this UMC stuff at all?
Well, so part of the reason the split happened as quickly as it did and at the time that it did was because the UMC created an exit path where people could take their property with them. And this is one of the reasons that a bunch of conservative churches are still in there, is some of them were told, stick around and we'll make real progress on this. But if you want to leave, you can do it now and you can take your building at essentially half price. So it varied from conference to conference, but the sort of most standard one was the congregation was allowed to leave with its building if they paid 50% of the worth of the building. I mean, this is one of the real complexities of denominations, right? The entanglement of a congregation and a denomination varies from one to one. It's often unclear to actual parishioners. I mean, maybe grandma was putting in 20% of her check for years and had no idea that the building wasn't owned by St. John's of Trinity, North Carolina, but actually by the headquarters, which she doesn't know any of those people and maybe doesn't trust them. So, I mean, I think that gets at some of the real complexity and real practical complexity. There are various ongoing lawsuits about how these decisions are made. A lot of Korean congregations in the UMC did not take this exit, in part because of a dispute about the ownership rules that I don't 100% follow. That's probably also part of the larger story of declining influence of denominations. I think increasingly people are, in the same way that individuals seem less interested in having those kind of larger brands and affiliations and affinities, a lot of congregations as well are increasingly likely to want to be non-denominational. A lot of them in practice are non-denominational, even though they've been UMC. I mean, Mike, you mentioned the challenge of moving around and finding new churches. I kind of think that's already happening. I don't know too many people, even among my friends who are very committed to church and very committed to certain Christian traditions. It's still pretty common to have someone, so I moved towns and now I go to an Anglican church, or I moved towns and, I'm not really Christian and Missionary Alliance, but this congregation is just so great and so vibrant, and I'm willing to adjust I did a little reporting at a Global Methodist Church in North Carolina a few months back, and every person I talked to who was a part of that church was a former Southern Baptist. And I was asking them questions like, oh, how do you feel about bishops? Like, one of the big questions in the Global Methodist Church is sort of the limits on bishops. And they're like, I didn't really know we had bishops. I just really like the preaching at this church. And
Well, if you leave, there's a grieving process for all the things you've left behind. If you stay, there's also a grieving process of the church you thought you knew. How would you encourage those who feel like they need to stay, that they are part of an evangelical remnant, that they want to be a thread of renewal in the church? What would you say to those folks who feel like this is where God has placed them?
I think it's a beautiful calling to deliberately put yourself in a position where you know that you're going to be uncomfortable is a sacrifice. And for those who feel called to stay, God is the only one who knows how this story unfolds and what the final chapters of this story will look like. So we need faithful people. And it's not to say that everybody else staying in the UMC is unfaithful, but we need people within that context who are continuing to make a case for a biblical vision of sexuality. So it's important to those who are going to stay. I really appreciate the sacrifice that they're making and wish them all the success they can get.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you for this conversation. It's great to actually sit in the same room together and talk. Thank you for the winsome witness, civil discourse, and we will see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. Our executive producer is Eric Petrick. Our producers are Clarissa Mall and Matt Stevens. Associate producers are Mackenzie Hill and Ryed Gillian. This episode was edited and mixed by Kevin Morris. Music by Dan Phelps, show design by Brian Todd, graphic design by Amy Jones, and social media by Kate Lockey.